Hi, Secretary. I think we have you.
Right, and we are starting right now. So, good afternoon. Welcome to the New Jersey edition of our state webinars exploring the findings from American Farmland Trust's recently released Farms Under Threat, the State of the States report. Before we get started, let me run through some logistics to help make this a good experience. You see that agenda. That's what we're going to do, but the logistics, let's talk about them. Everyone has been muted, so no need to do that yourself. We will have time for some questions. If you would like to ask one or make a comment, look at the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an orange arrow at the top of that panel that allows the panel to shrink and reopen. In that panel, you'll see a question section of the control panel. You can decouple that question box to pop it out and type in your question or comment. There's a little square right there that you will see that allows you to do that. And lastly, we are recording this webinar and we'll send the link of the recording to everyone who registered. Please feel free to share this recording with others. Let me now introduce myself. I am Chris Coffin. I am American Farmland Trust Senior Policy Advisor. I also direct our newly launched National Agricultural Land Network, which I'll talk about at the end of the webinar. Co-hosting with me is Erica Goodman, AFT's New York Regional Director. For those of you not familiar with American Farmland Trust, let me do a really quick introduction. AFT is a national nonprofit membership organization founded in 1980. Some know us best by our No Farms, No Food bumper sticker. We started as and remain an agricultural land trust, but that is one small part of our work. We partner with a wide variety of organizations to develop tools to help farmers improve soil health and water quality and to mitigate climate change, and on strategies and policies to expand land access opportunities for next generation farmers. Our programming is grounded in research like this and informs our state and federal policy development and advocacy. So let me turn it now over to Erica.
Thanks, Chris. The work that we will be covering today was completed in partnership with NRCS and Conservation Science Partners. We're grateful for their support and collaboration, along with numerous partners in New Jersey that are joining us here today, including New Jersey State Department of Agricultural Development Committee, numerous land trusts and county regional planning commissions, farm and food organizations, and even have some farmers on the line. So thank you all for joining us today and for your continued partnership in the work happening in New Jersey. I now would like to introduce two very special guests we have joining us today. Secretary of Agriculture for the state of New Jersey, Douglas Fisher, has joined us this morning or this afternoon. Secretary Fisher has been in this role for more than a decade, overseeing policies and programs to promote, protect, and service New Jersey agriculture. He brings a long history of working within the farm and food system with 30 years in the supermarket industry and served several terms in the state assembly representing the 3rd District, among other accolades. We're also joined by Susan Payne, who is Executive Director of the New Jersey State Agriculture Development Committee. In her role, Susan directs all aspects of the state's farmland preservation program and the New Jersey Right to Farm program, among other areas. I know many of you on the call are probably familiar with both Secretary Fisher and Susan, so we're really grateful for them for taking their time this afternoon to join us. Susan will have to be jumping on later in the webinar to contribute to the Q&A session, but wanted to kick things off first with you, Secretary Fisher, and have you speak a little bit about what you see happening in the state. And, you know, we'll be digging into this a little bit sooner, but first I wanted to say congratulations, because New Jersey ranked #1 in the country for its policy response to addressing the threat of farmland and the loss of farmland in the state. And that's in comparing to states across the country. So congratulations, and I'll turn it over to you, Secretary Fisher, for some of your thoughts and insight on the state of agriculture in the state and for this #1 ranking you received.
Well, thank you, Erica, and thank you, Chris. It's nice to hear your voices and great to be here. First, let me say that, you know, your work is extraordinary, and we always love partnering with American Farmland Trust. By the way, I did not know that No Farmers, No Food actually originated with you. but certainly that's an expression that is used across the country and is embraced by so many because it's so true. So we're really proud and gratified to have received this #1 ranking. We're a small state, but I think that we're a microcosm in terms of all the issues that face agriculture going forward, being the most densely populated state, but also having an extraordinary agricultural heritage and future, frankly, in New Jersey. You know, the program has been in existence for 37 years. A couple of things that I would note is that #1, it's really remarkable that has been completely and entirely nonpartisan. Every administration, and they've flipped back and forth from party to party, and legislature since the program's inception has supported it regardless of party affiliation. I think that's a tribute to New Jersey and the people in the state, because the voters have been consistently, frankly, relentless in their support for preserving farmland and keeping the garden in the garden state. And that means that voters have approved dedicated funds at the municipal level, the county level, and the state level, all at the same time. And they voted their pocketbooks and wallets. And it's one of the parts of our program that is, I think, really very notable, is that it's a bottom-up program. It's built at the county level. It's not the state dictating where farmland should be preserved, but rather the state helping local governments and nonprofit partners achieve farmland preservation where they think that it makes sense in their communities and their counties. And so there's really strong support at all levels of government. When you ask about the state of agriculture in the Garden State, we grow 100 different crops. We have a very varied agricultural landscape. We are #1 in certain categories and certain crops. For instance, within the top 10, #1 in certain areas, like we're within the top 10 in the rankings of the crops that we grow. One of the things that struck me that I would love to discuss at some time in the future is that when you ask folks in their communities, they are always, for the most part, supportive of farms. They talk about open space, and they love the two concepts and what it means to them in their communities. I think the one thing that probably is not talked about so much is the soil, where people don't realize just how important it is that we make sure that we maintain, the arable land and the soil itself, how precious it is. So, as I said, I appreciate this ranking. We've worked very hard for it, and I want to pay tribute to the SADC and Susan Payne, who's the executive director, has been there for a number of years, and it shows because we have such continuity in terms of what we do with our farmland preservation efforts. So thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Fisher. We really appreciate your thoughtful comments and overview of kind of the state of agriculture and the state of farmland protection in the state. I know we'll continue to be working with you in the Department of Agriculture around ways to keep land in farming. And as you mentioned, to think about the soil as well and think about other aspects as this work as well as other works moves forward. So thank you for the work that you do and the team that you lead and for taking the time today to join us. As I mentioned, Susan will jump on a little bit later in the conversation, but for now, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris, who will lead us through some more information about the report.
Great. Thank you, Erica. And thank you again for joining us, Secretary Fisher and Susan. We hope you can stay with us for the rest of the webinar, and thank you both for your leadership. Let's now talk about the findings from our Farms Under Threat report. Today, we're focusing on the state of the states, which is the second in our research series. State of the States paints a striking picture of the threats facing working farms and ranches in every state and documents the steps every state has taken to protect their agricultural land base from development. We used a multi-pronged approach that included advanced spatial mapping to identify the threat to agricultural land, and an in-depth analysis of state policy responses. We're using this report to raise public awareness, to inform state and federal policy, and to encourage more direct and permanent agricultural land protection. For those of you who did not join us for our launch events last month, I want to touch very quickly on our national findings. From 2001 to 2016, a period of historically low housing starts, the U.S. converted 11 million acres of agricultural land. That's equal to all the land planted in 2017 in the United States to fruits, nuts, and vegetables. The majority of that conversion was to low density residential land use, a conversion that is not as visible but poses a significant threat to agriculture. And more than 1/3 of the land converted was what we have identified as nationally significant land, the land best suited for intensive food and crop production. Next slide. So here you see that New Jersey has made a huge amount of progress and leads the states in its policy response and still is threatened. And a note about this slide, that this slide combined in the threat to states that lost the most acreage and those states that lost the highest percents of their agricultural land. And obviously, it's very difficult to equate New Jersey to Texas. The amount of land loss in Texas is huge. The amount of land loss in New Jersey is relatively small, but for New Jersey, it is still a fairly high percent. And that is why New Jersey still finds itself on this list. And as we will get to, while New Jersey has done a huge amount of efforts to respond, that it's now a time when New Jersey cannot let its foot off of the accelerator in terms of continuing to focus on this as an issue. So let's now dive into the data available for New Jersey on the interactive website. And I am going to be helped today by my colleague Beth Fraser, who is our fabulous website navigator. We're going to start with pointing out this tab over here, the Reports and Data tab. This is where you'll find the fact sheets that describe our methodology. And if you're interested in getting access to the geospatial data we used, you can make a request by going to that geospatial data layer tab right there. If you click on it, it takes you to a form and we will respond and let you know how soon we will be sending out that data. So now let's go to the drop-down menu and pick New Jersey. And you will see that you can, from this website, have both spatial mapping and the policy scorecard. So we are now on the spatial mapping side. And let's start with land cover and use, which you see up here now. We've used multiple national data sets to develop the best available spatial inventory of agricultural land use in the US. You can zoom in on this data layer to identify every type of land use in the state, including conversion to urban and highly developed land or low density residential land use. Note that one new feature of our research is that we have spatially identified woodland associated with farms. All told, we show 782,300 acres of agricultural land in New Jersey, composed of cropland, pasture, and woodland associated with farms. Now let's look at the PVR index. To understand not just the quantity, but the quality of land being converted, this is to Secretary Fisher's point about the soil, we created a first ever assessment of agricultural land quality that specifically accounts for productivity, versatility, and resiliency. This PVR index was developed in consultation with a national panel of experts. You'll see the ranges in New Jersey from the darker green, which indicates the higher suitability for long-term intensive crop production, especially for food crops such as fruits, nuts, vegetables, and staple grains. Again, the index is darker green, higher, lighter green, lower on that index. So let's go to nationally significant. We used this PVR index to identify the best land in the country for producing crops, especially human edible food crops. This is land we consider nationally significant. In New Jersey, you can see that 60, well, you can't see it because we are in full screen mode, which is good. Stay there, Beth. But, well, okay, great. You can see that 61% of agricultural land, or about 475,000 acres, is considered nationally significant. This includes about 355,000 acres of cropland, 59,000 acres of pasture, and 61,000 acres of woodland. The last category here is conversion. As I mentioned earlier, the time period we analyzed was a short one, 2001 to 2016, and one with a deep recession in the middle of it. We mapped the conversion of agricultural land to two types of land use: urban and highly developed land use, or UHD, and low density residential land use, or LDR. UHD includes the traditional culprits in farmland conversion. Those are expanding residential, commercial, and industrial areas, but it also includes rural, industrial, and energy production sites, including oil and gas, well pads, and solar panel installations. This project is the first of its kind to quantify the extent of large lot housing on the agricultural land base. So this low density residential land use ranges from lower density subdivisions to rural areas where more and more individual houses are being built. And we can come back to this during the question and answer period if people have questions about it. All told, New Jersey converted just under 71,000 acres, the majority of that, 55%, to low density residential land use. Our analysis also showed that ag land in low density residential use in 2001 was 5 times more likely to be converted to urban and highly developed land use by 2016 than other agricultural land. Before we go out of spatial, Beth, can you take a minute to point out the highlight summary tab? So just so that folks know, we have created these nifty 2-page PDF versions with key findings. These are things that you can use in a newsletter, or you can print off and give to members or donors or legislators. They can be used for any number of a variety of different purposes, but just know that they are out there and they are easily downloaded. So before we go back, before we turn to policy, we want to ask you all what you see as the biggest conversion threats for New Jersey over the next 10 to 20 years. So Beth, if you can launch the poll, that would be great. Feel free to vote for more than one answer. And if you have trouble voting, it might be because you're in full screen mode and you need to go out of that in order to vote. And the reason why we're asking that, because this question, is because when we think about policy responses, those responses may depend on what we collectively feel and think are going to be the biggest drivers of conversion going forward. Okay, so here we go. This is very interesting. That it's a combination of thinking of both poorly planned and more residential, commercial, industrial development, but that the generational threat and the generational transfer of ag land is considered a likely driver. So let's think about that when we're talking through policy. So thank you, Beth. Let's now turn to the policy scorecard. And our intention with the scorecard is to highlight effective elements of state policies around the country that address the 3 main drivers of what has been the historical drivers of agricultural land conversion: poorly planned development, weak agricultural viability or profitability, and the fact that land is most vulnerable when it transfers between generations. While AFT has been at the forefront of federal and state policy development around land retention and protection since our founding, This is our first effort at a comprehensive state policy scorecard. And I just want to pause and say, we understand that it is not completely comprehensive, that there are states that are doing much to support the viability of farming and farm businesses in a number of different ways through grants and loans and business development and support for marketing of all kinds. We chose the 6 policies that we felt addressed some of these conversion threats that were tied to the land. So the things that we looked at were the purchase of agricultural conservation easement programs and what states were doing in terms of those types of programs. There are 28 states that have PACE programs where they're either directly purchasing agricultural conservation easement from willing farmers, or that they are working with county either county programs and or land trusts, as New Jersey does in terms of partnering on those types of PACE programs. We looked also at land use planning and growth management, understanding that land use planning sort of comes from 2 ways. It's at its fundamental on the ground, and people, again, as Secretary Fisher talked about, that it's communities choosing to make decisions about their land use. But we also recognize that there is a value to having states having goals that are around compact development, goals around retaining and protecting agricultural land. So we looked at that as well. We looked at property tax relief for agricultural land. Again, every state does some kind of preferential tax treatment for agriculture, recognizing that working lands require less in services, and therefore they should have a lower tax rate. We looked at agricultural district programs, which are an effort to try and provide support in a number of different ways to farmers and farm businesses. We looked at farm link programs. Now, the programs we looked at were just those state programs, not privately funded programs. And farm link and state leasing were the 2 programs and policies we looked at that focused around that land access and the generational transfer. Farm Link, again, trying to match the farm seekers and those looking for land opportunities with land owners. And state leasing, looking at what are the ways that a state can incentivize the use of its state-owned land for the purpose of agricultural production. So with that, let's scroll down a little bit. Thanks to the work of the SADC and many partners on the call today, as we mentioned earlier, New Jersey, my apologies, tops all 50 states in its total score. It is also one of only a couple of states that have all 6 policies in place. And it, along with Delaware, gets top score on PACE. On every other policy, it is at or well above the median. And we just, again, have to say that this is quite an accomplishment and to commend the state on its work in this area. The website allows you to dive into the factors behind the scores. So let's go to the Select the Policy or Program tab and go to PACE programs. So if you look at PACE here, you will see that New Jersey scores extremely well. The only category where it does not get points is for this provisions promoting agricultural use and ownership. And Beth, if you can scroll to the bottom, people can see then how we scored it. And this explains what these scores are, what we were looking for, what we felt were innovations in particular areas. And so you'll see on this provisions promoting agricultural use and ownership, were the fact that some states have mechanisms called options to purchase at agricultural value or preemptive purchase rights. They go by either name. And some have affirmative covenants to farm as part of their PACE programs. So this is something, again, where we looked at what some programs have and not others. I always want to point out the importance of leveraging federal dollars in this with PACE programs. New Jersey has done a great job of doing that through the Federal Agricultural Conservation Easement Program, or ASEP. I hope that the changes in the 2018 Farm Bill and administrative changes to the program being made by NRCS will enable New Jersey to leverage additional federal funding over the next couple of years. So let's go back and look at land use planning. Again, New Jersey does really well and gets a high score for farmland protection planning, thanks to the county planning incentive grants. What you see here is that states with the highest scores have state goals around saving farmland and promoting compact development, and require some consistency with those goals at the community level. Let's go to property tax relief. So on property tax relief, again, New Jersey gets high points for the percent of agricultural land that is subject to current use. Some states plow their withdrawal penalties back into farmland protection, and some states require additional covenants on land enrolled through current use. On ag districts, the only area where New Jersey didn't score any points, as you can see, is on the tax incentives. And we gave states credit for those who do tie some additional tax incentives to their agricultural districts. And let me stop there and just say one point that I think it's important to make, and you might have seen it at the score overall. There are a lot of policies and sort of bells and whistles within each of these, in the ag districts program, in property tax relief, that we wanted to highlight because we feel that they are innovations, and certainly New Jersey has its fair share of them. But because of that, there's no state that came close to being at 100, and we don't expect any state to be at 100, because again, this is as much about us trying to share innovations from states around the country, and including a number of things that may or may not work for any particular state. So it may be valuable for New Jersey to consider tax incentives in association with their ag districts. It may not be. We're not necessarily suggesting that it's something that New Jersey really needs to do. So just the last couple on FarmLink. Again, it gets a good score, but you will see that where New Jersey does not get any points is on authority and on number of referrals. And that is because we ideally like to see explicit statutory authority for a state program, because we feel that ultimately that provides it a greater likelihood of continuity. And we like to see states tracking the referrals that are being made through FarmLink. And so lastly, on state leasing, I think in looking through it, it appears that New Jersey's score is not higher because of the percent of leased land, which seems to be fairly small. And again, it may be there that there's simply not that much state-owned land that can be leased. And Susan, you might be able to offer perspectives on that when we stop. So I hope that was a helpful cruise through the findings. If you do have questions, please write them down now. As we go out of the website, we're going to launch another poll, which asks which policy or policies you think would be most valuable to focus on for New Jersey. And if you don't see it, and I recognize that we had to sort of drop off the ones that are around generational transfer, because we only had 5 spots. Please feel free to write that in as a comment. But amongst these four choices, which of these do you feel would be the most valuable to focus on? Okay. Look at that. That is very interesting. So, property tax relief. We can talk about that a little bit later. Land use planning. Those are the top two. And I suspect that there were probably some who thought that programs around generational transfer might be useful as well. And that's not to say, and I guess I should say a caveat here, that generational transfer, we know that the purchase of ag conservation easements is an important generational transfer tool, that agricultural districts, by supporting the business of farming, can help with viability and therefore helps to encourage a next generation of farmers. So I don't mean to suggest that state leasing and FarmLink are the only transfer tools. So let's go back out and let me talk for just 1 minute about what was missing from our spatial analysis is the protected agricultural land, because there is not a comprehensive data layer, a national comprehensive data layer focused on agricultural land protection. We are now building this new database. If you have not heard from us and you hold easements, please let us know by writing something in on the comment in the question line. We will be back in touch with people who we have not heard from to add that, but it's great to see that there is a lot of green already in New Jersey. So let me stop there and turn it over to Erica, who might have questions.
Thanks, Chris. We have gotten a few questions come in, and once again, I just wanted to introduce Susan Payne, who's the Executive Director of the New Jersey State Agriculture Development Committee, who's joined us here for some questions. I'm actually going to ask the first one to you, Susan. We had some questions in about kind of what people are seeing, kind of what's the attribution of success, and just wanted to hear from you. I know the Secretary shared a little bit of why the state ranked so well, but what is your perspective of how New Jersey did rank so well in looking at the policies that it has in place?
Thank you. So, I mean, why successful? I think that in a kind of an ironic way, New Jersey, because it's so densely populated, the public has a very firsthand understanding of the threat to development, right? So the amount of money the voters of New Jersey continue to vote to tax themselves, you know, to raise municipal, county, and state funds for land conservation is incredible. And it's because people don't have to go very far to understand what it means to lose their agricultural landscape. So I think that is a different challenge in rural places, you know, and your map of the whole country is just so amazing to see how much valuable land, you know, cropland in the country is in very rural areas. And I would imagine it's harder to make the argument and harder to get public support for raising funds, right, to protect those lands because people don't perceive the threat. So that's a little bit of the silver lining around how much development pressure we do have here is it's not hard to convince the public that we need funds to permanently protect our farmland. And, you know, I have to also say that the agricultural community has fully embraced the farmland protection program. And I think that if you're in New Jersey, you kind of take that for granted, you know, but when you hear about what's going on in other parts of the country, you know, it's not always the farm bureaus and the state boards of agriculture in other states support farmland protection. And, you know, that sounds ironic to us, but it's true. And so, you know, the program doesn't work if farmers don't believe in it. And so I really think that that's been a key to our success too. And then I think, you know, I mean, Secretary Fisher touched on sort of the sustained political support for the program. But I think that this kind of strong, you know, backbone kind of relationship between the state and the county boards, you know, we are constantly in communication. We are constantly helping and giving technical assistance in every way we can. the fact that that relationship is so strong, I think makes this program run.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I'll just highlight from one of your earlier comments there that the research and the report does show both urban development and then low density residential land use, as Chris talked about a little bit. And with about a 50-50 split in New Jersey, one thing that the low density tends to lean towards less visible. But as you highlighted, with half of the land use and the conversion being of urban or visible, as you mentioned, then that certainly encourages states to have a higher policy response. So it's definitely I think one question asked if it's a squeeze between the major metropolitan areas, and that certainly highlights the visibility of the pressure on the land.
Right.
I'll just couple quick questions from Chris about the kind of use of the data. Can it be broken down by county or municipality? And do folks have access to the GIS information?
Thank you, Erica. Yes, there is, again, as I said at the beginning, and for those who might have joined late, we are making I'm not positive if it's all of the data layers or most of them available. And if you go on the interactive website to the reports and data tab and go down to the geospatial data layer, you can request that information. Yes. Does it work at the county and municipal level? It certainly can, but I want to make a point about the low density residential land use tab. I mean, that data set, that was modeling that we did, and it involved looking at both the Census of Agriculture county level data for the median farm size. And from that, we created percentiles that went down to the lowest 10th percentile of farm size for that county. And it was that bottom 10% in terms of what that acreage number was, is where we considered something to be low density residential. We then looked at the census housing block data to figure out where there has been housing built. So you will see, if you drill down in looking at the low density residential land use data layer, that there is some active farming, and we're not suggesting that there isn't still some agriculture that is happening within that. What we are saying, though, is that when you get down to farming at that very small acreage, it can be profitable, and we understand that. And we understand that there are some farms that are very focused on a particular crop, that have a particular market that they can satisfy with small acreage. So again, we don't want to knock small acre farms, but what we are saying is that when you are farming with a lot of non-farming neighbors around you, it makes management much more complicated, and that it is a trend that, if not addressed and if it continues, becomes more of a challenge, because there are not those sort of larger blocks of farmland that are more easily managed for a farm business.
Great, thanks, Chris. I have one more question for Susan, and then I know we'll have a couple more slides and we'll have some more time for questions at the end. Susan, there were a few questions that highlighted some population shifts. So looking at previous trends where population was maybe moving more to cities or even to smaller communities around cities that would have easy access, and then also to think about what trends might look like in the future with potential impacts from the current climate, economic and pandemic related. And so curious if you're having some initial thinking about what understanding these trends, seeing some of the information from this report, how that might impact threats to farmland in New Jersey.
Thanks, Erica. So, I think it's a really interesting time to be having this webinar when we're still in the teeth of coronavirus, and everybody, at least, folks who had office jobs or computer related jobs, to the degree of our understanding of our ability to be productive and get our work done without being physically in an office has been, I think, staggering, and across the country, right? And so what does that mean? And if everything you read these days is true, they're talking about development trends that are going to be different in the future than they were in the past, based on our, kind of coming to an understanding that we can be highly productive remote. And so then you ask, okay, well then what's the impact of that on land use? And I think, in New Jersey, we had like the go-go, the 70s and the 80s, just enormous, transfer of land from agricultural uses into residential subdivisions. But we are, a state that's straddling, between two metro markets of New York and Philadelphia. And so most of the concentration of development is in the shadow of those cities, right? And then the Route 1 corridor that connects them. But, I think in the future, we have to start realizing that to be in a white collar job in an office doesn't necessarily mean you're going to need to be in an office anymore. And I tend to think that's going to put a new and different kind of pressure on farmland, because when people are out there making decisions about where to buy their house, it's always been, well, what's the commute? What's the length of the commute? Can I get a train into the city? Can I drive into the city or to Trenton or wherever? And this may change that, both the ability to work remotely and electric cars in the next 20 years. If people don't need to commute, they can just get in a car and the robot's going to drive them to work so that they can be productive. I think these trends are going to put more pressure on residential development in places that we think right now are kind of taken off the table since kind of the end of the before the recession. And so, not only that, but sort of competition for land from warehouse industry, right? So residential development has always been the biggest challenge for retaining farmland, but of late, since the residential housing market kind of softened in rural areas, the housing, the market for converting farmland to warehouses has increased exponentially. So we're seeing it's not like 102 acres being taken off the table at a time. You're seeing 500, 600, 700 acres taken off the table at a time. It's just enormous footprint. So that is certainly going to be a challenge. And then I think our third biggest kind of land use challenge is large scale solar. Um, you know, most folks are very supportive of New Jersey trying to get carbon neutral and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that all makes a ton of sense. The question is, how is that going to be accomplished? I have to, give a shout out to AFT and your work to try to help figure out how to make solar development on a large scale compatible with agriculture rather than replacing agriculture as a land use. And I think if we can, get really creative there, maybe we can, have a land use pattern that makes both of them work. So, I think, if I could say anything to the people on the line, it's, I think we've had a great success over these last 37 years, but it's not even close to being finished, and the threats are going to be different. They're going to come from different quarters, and ultimately time is always our enemy in farmland protection. So so we really have to keep our eye on the ball and figure out what the next 35 years is going to hold, because it's not going to be the same thing as the last 35 years.
Very true, Susan, very true. Thanks for sharing. We're going to pause a moment on questions and go through a couple more slides, and hopefully we'll have time for additional questions. And if not, we've had a lot come through. So know that we'll be following up in the coming weeks and checking back with those who did submit questions to make sure we get some answers to you. So what we're seeing is that, we have, time is not really on our side when we're thinking about the pressure on the land. And so as many of you know, and as we've kind of talked about a little bit on this call, is that we really want AFT to help be a resource around state policy development, this research to be a resource, and to be able to provide some of that input. But we're kind of working on some loftier goals that have been put forth by the release of this national work and being able to grow both what's happening in New Jersey, but also across the country, so that states are learning from each other and able to expand their work. And, you know, the goal that AFT has just recently announced is, you know, looking to permanently protect by 2040, double the amount of farmland that it has to date, and then also reducing the rate of that conversion from 2,000 acres a day to 500 acres a day within the same time frame. And so New Jersey has been, you know, being a leader already in a lot of areas on policy, will be an important partner for us to think about that nationally, and even just to continue to move forward with your goals at the local and state level as well. So, you know, we're here to be a resource, as I mentioned, and there are a number of actions that we're starting to take nationally that are heading towards those goals. It's really working and building upon the Farms Under Threat work to think at a national scale what can be done and what can be achieved. And so, you know, this is just highlighting a few of where AFT is working to kind of strengthen our work. Chris leads the National Ag Lands Network, and I know she'll talk about that a little bit more before we jump off today. But that's a great resource that's growing and evolving, and we hope that many of you can be a part of if you're not already. You know, looking at where in the country are there limits still to capacity, and so where can AFT help to support growth of policies and programs in key locations across the country, making sure that we're supporting and working with our partners to really protect more land and to reduce the conversion, working to advocate for stronger state and federal policies. We can learn from each other so much from this data when we both do a deep dive within each state, but also pull that out more broadly. So how can we use that information to strengthen both at the state and federal level, and also to make sure that there's data that is available to organizations and agencies across the country to be able to really ground their decision making. And that's really what the Farms Under Threat tools are put together to support. So thinking a little bit more specifically in New Jersey, again, this is really meant for you to be using as best you can, and Chris touched a little bit on how you can do that with either GIS expertise or even just digging into the data as it is on the website. And so, you know, encouraging continued use of that and continue for the engagement of states and communities who really have a great understanding of land trends in their backyard to continue to collaborate and think about analyzing and mapping that information. The national research showed that greater coordination is key. New Jersey is doing some of this. Protected properties are on the farm link listings. State ranking criteria encourages coordination, consistency, and local actions, but really being able to identify where more coordination is possible. So we'll be looking at that in New Jersey, especially relevant in kind of life and times of COVID-19 and the weaknesses we've seen highlighted in the concentration of the globalized supply chains is supporting farmers to keep land in farming and to keep farmers on the land in order to contribute to local food resiliency and food security within the state. And I know there are a couple of questions that came in that we're thinking about both labor and ag viability, and those are not touched on in this report, but certainly connect, these findings will connect to those areas in order to think about how we're addressing and thinking about food systems resiliency. And I'll note here too is that New Jersey does have some of the most expensive farmland in the country, and how important it is to make it easier for a new generation to access land. And that's certainly something we want to continue to work on. In ensuring that farmers can and must be part of the solution to combating climate change, well-managed farms can help to cool the globe. And it's really our best farmland that does it most effectively. And looking at the information from Farms Under Threat will be able to help us to identify the capability of land to sequester carbon and really improve soils, but also soils that aren't paved over are actually able to be part of the climate solution. And so we want to think about that in this research. And then finally, 61% of New Jersey's farmland is considered nationally significant for food and crop production with little environmental impact. And when nationally significant land is impacted by development in many of the ways that Susan just laid out, intense food production is pushed to more marginal lands. And so we want to think about how are we saving the best, but also there's value for food resiliency and addressing climate change and kind of all the other benefits that farmland provide with the rest of the farm in there too. So there's certainly a focus on the highest productive, versatile, and resilient farmland in this research, but we want to be able to keep an eye and support the continuation of farming on the rest of the farmland that exists in the state as well. So I think, Chris, I think we got a few minutes left. I'll turn it back to you. I can also walk through a few questions.
Great. So here I have been looking at the questions, and here's one that, to your point about climate and best soils, this is a question probably best posed to Susan, which is, would the SADC consider being part of an effort to offer crop insurance discounts to preserved farm owners who implement soil conservation practices? This could be a way to bring attention to farmland preservation and the many benefits that it can offer.
So I thank you for that question. We are in our office kind of kicking around ideas about how to engage in this question. Not necessarily so much on insurance payments, but how to start to identify what environmental resources are existing on farms and acknowledging the ecosystem service value of those resources and figuring out, can we compensate landowners, and not just in a one-time payment, but can we create a mechanism to compensate landowners over time for that ecosystem service? Because I think one of the challenges of any mature farmland preservation program is, we all do a lot of attention and focus and celebration, to the point of we close the farm, and we hand it over the check and thank goodness, and we all walk away. But in New Jersey, we have farms that have had second, third, fourth owners. Those properties have turned over. And I think that later generation of farmers is saying, well, gee, you guys are all stick and no carrot, right? This is a restriction on my land and what I can do. And well, grandma got the check, 30 years ago, but what about me? How can SADC help farmers be more viable? And so we, currently we provide grants for soil and water conservation practice implementation. We can provide funding for deer fencing, which I think is unique in the country for a farmland protection program to help fund deer fencing. And so then the next thing we're kind of looking into is this question of resiliency and ecosystem services, carbon sequestration. We're not quite sure, what the aspects of it are, but we're very interested in continuing to work with owners of preserved farmland to compensate them in a way that makes sense for the public, to protect those resources, and it makes sense for the farmer to help them be more viable.
Unmuted. Great, thank you, Susan. And I would just say from the AFT perspective is we are right there with you in terms of thinking about this. We have been doing a lot of work in the Midwest on crop insurance rebates for cover crops. That is not necessarily focused on protected lands, but we agree completely with you about the need to think about what are those sort of longer term payment streams that can be provided, especially to permanently protected farms that are, now going to be available in perpetuity. So what are the ways to encourage and incentivize higher conservation benefits from those properties? Right. So that is a good segue. I'm now going to wrap it up because we are close. So let me take the last couple of minutes here just to talk for a minute about what you guys are seeing here on the screen about the Farmland Information Center and the National Agricultural Land Network. And let me start with the Farmland Information Center, or FIC, as it is affectionately known here at AFT. It is a collaborative effort with USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service. It is both a website with a huge amount of information that ranges from state and federal policy information to what is about to be now a treasure trove of information about ASEP, the federal ASEP AL program, application materials, information for landowners interested in applying with a county or state program or land trust. There's also a wealth of information and statistics and information for farmers and farmland owners. The National Agricultural Land Network is a newly launched project of AFTs. I am delighted that Susan is going to be sitting on our steering committee for that network. So thank you for that, Susan. Your expertise will be very valuable for that. The network is intended to provide professional development, peer networking, educational resources for those who are professionally engaged in agricultural land protection or planning related to agriculture. So state agencies are welcome, county agencies, county PACE programs, county planners, nonprofit soil and water conservation districts, land trusts. These are the types of entities who are welcome to join. It is a membership. It's free. It is educational only. No need to be worried about advocacy. We will talk about policy. We'll have a lot of conversations about policy. And we will, in fact, one of the next things that the network is going to offer is a series of policy webinars that will focus on each of these 6 policies and look in detail at what is working around the state and what some of these innovations are that various states have. So look for more information about that. But if you go to this farmland.org, NALN, you will see a way to sign up, and I hope folks will do that. So with that, let me turn it back to you, Erica, for the last word.
Thanks. Well, I will first say thank you to Secretary Fisher and to Susan for joining today. I'll pause a moment if either of you had any last words you want to mention.
This is Susan. So I just want to really thank AFT. I mean, not just because New Jersey came out #1, but even if we hadn't, this is an outstanding effort on your part. It's exactly what the country needed, and I think it is going to be transformative, and I think it's going to help every state figure out what they can do better and get quick access to examples from other states to make change more quickly. So I just applaud your efforts and the leadership of AFT for making this happen.
Thank you, Susan, and we appreciate the partnership and the leadership that the New Jersey has provided, and I think there's a lot of work to do, but I'm glad to have both the SADC as a great partner in the Department of Ag, but also many of the other partners who are on the line today. I think it's a collaborative effort, both in the success and in the road ahead. So I will leave us there. There are so many questions who were maybe not addressed as we were on the call today, but know that we'll be compiling some FAQs from across the presentations that are being provided across the country, but also want to follow up with you specifically about questions that were raised in the chat that we weren't able to get to on the group conversation. But again, thank you to Susan, to Secretary Fisher, to Chris for pulling this all together. And we have both on our team, Beth Frazier and Tammy Holtby, who've been doing all the tech on the back end. So wanted to thank them as well. And to all of you on the line, we really appreciate your partnership and leadership, and look forward to continuing to work together in the future. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Unmuted.